Hi everyone. Today we're going to do the critical analysis process, and we're going to take a look at the grade 9 to 12 curriculum while we go through this. And this is going to be done while analyzing and interpreting the work of Swapna Tamhane's Mobile Palace. So we're going to use a critical analysis process, which looks like this. We start with the initial reaction, move on to the analysis and interpretation, and then we consider the cultural context. And then finally, but not really always finally, we have expression of aesthetic judgment. And the reason why I was a little iffy on that is because there is encouraged to be ongoing reflection. The gray arrows show that ongoing reflection should be happening between several steps, as well as after we are done initially looking through this process and continue to apply what we learned to other artwork in the future. So first, we have initial reaction. Often what steps we're at will be reminded to us by these orange blocks here. So initial reaction, what do we see? So here's some sample guiding questions. What is our first impression of this work? What does this work bring to mind? What emotions does this work evoke? What puzzles us? And what connections we can make? So what do I see when I first look at this work? So for example, I see plenty of fabric. I see that in some shots it takes up majority of the room. I also see a tent-like shape, um, which is quite bold and centered in the room. Um, it seems quite large in this gallery space, and I see lots of patterns as well on this fabric involving geometric shapes. The way the fabric is draped reminds me of curtains that I might see at a performing arts theater. It's also reminiscent of maybe a grand event venue where something is being celebrated, something like a wedding or a special occasion, except I see that it's not quite that look entirely. The patterns are also repetitive. I almost feel that maybe these patterns are uh, extensive. They make me feel possibly overwhelmed, or they might even excite me. The colors of the draped fabric appear bold in pigment. They're mostly blue and red. And I might be puzzled by why the curtains are draped the way they are, the meaning of that, the meaning of these patterns, the meaning of repetition, the meaning of fabric here. So we're going to move on to the next stage, where we are going to try and evaluate our analysis and interpretation here. We want to keep in mind that we want to describe elements, principles, or materials that are being used, and we want to find evidence for our interpretations at this stage. At each stage, we also want to continue to try and reflect. So some sample guiding questions would be, what elements, principles, and or conventions of the art form are used in this work? How are the elements or principles organized, combined, and or even arranged in this work by the artist? What do we think is the theme or subject of this work? What is the artist trying to communicate and why? Um, what do we think the artist, uh, why do we think the artist created this work? What message or meaning do we think the work conveys? And what do we think the views of the artist is of the world? And do we agree or disagree with them? So I can see here in Swapna Tamhane's work, there is carefully repeated geometric design. It depicts a shape that is dominantly triangles. These triangles appear to be printed on fabric. Some of these triangles vary in paint opacity and color, whereas patterns on different curtains seem almost machine-made, intentional, and asymmetric, with less of the artist's hand to be seen. In the close-up, I see red fabric sewn on another piece of red fabric, with the pattern being forced to continue over it. It feels as though it's trying its best to continue despite a foundational interruption. I start to connect this to my understanding of the desperation of mass-consumed fast fashion. Some of the fabric that looks perfectly printed and symmetrical is juxtaposed with ripped up and resewn fabric with inconsistent inking. This made me connect the work's meaning to possibly allude to the duality of fast fashion. The process is something that society avoids acknowledging, as it can be dreary with the infliction of slave labor, usually involving children or lesser fortunate individuals in life-threatening conditions, versus the final result of those same materials once they're all done, twinkling and on display at common clothing stores in North America and even in metropolitan cities across the world. I could even make the connection that vast amounts of fabric that is presented here is prompting me to consider overconsumption as the theme. If this were Tamhain's worldview, would I agree or disagree with this work? I also have a strong feeling that the juxtaposition of this process of fast fashion versus the result of it could be a theme, as well as there also could be a juxtaposition of other things going on here. Possibly a juxtaposition of two dominant cultures. And this might be conveyed in the artwork here. So we're going to pause to reflect, or we have the option to. So far we've covered these two steps, and what I've circled in red are these gray arrows that show some sort of interchangeability. This is where I might want to go back to my initial reaction and think of if I agree with what I first saw still, or if my thoughts have changed, maybe I see something different. So I want to go back and see at several parts of this process if I'm able to make better judgments of the work from what I first thought of it. So next in this CAP is considering the cultural context behind this work. So pictured here is Swapna Tamhain. I believe it was important to include a photo of the artist as we do get a sense of their identity, and it's important to take this into consideration as we continue researching this work. So some sample guiding questions at this point. Again, there's the orange block on this slide here, reminding us of the step that we're at. So we have what are social, political, and historical events that may have influenced the artist in this work? What cultural movements, events, or traditions or other works in the arts may have influenced the artist? And what events in the artist's life may have affected the creation of the work? And we can even dig deeper. We can think of what we research, and we can think of the initial reception of the work by critics. We can look at other examples of other works created in the same time. And we can see similarities and differences between specific works in the past and present. And we can do this by looking at Tamhain's other work. And we can also see the way in which a work in the arts represents the perspective of individuals within a specific cultural group. So these are some things that I go on to keep in mind in my consideration of cultural context of the work. So I've gone online and spent time researching the artist, and these are some things that I found that stood out to me that I thought were important to consider here. So Tamhain was born in Toronto, Canada, and is now based in Montreal. I discovered from her bio, her artist bio, that she is interested in making paper, handmade paper in her works as a foundation for her drawings, and she really enjoys to do drawings. Tamhain also has collaborated with artists based in India, specifically in block printing and embroidering, which is interesting because those two modes of art making are presented here in this work. She intends on exploring how art making and craft making and design has been divided by colonialism. She has done substantial research in contemporary art and design in the history of India. focusing on feminist history. Could it be that her upbringing and life events living in Canada has inspired an interest in wanting to know more about India's historical art as it was challenged by colonialism? After finding a press article on this work, I found out more about the meanings of what is represented in this work. The article says, while they are largely associated with displays of imperial power and sites of militaristic strategizing, these structures are also used for weddings, celebrations, improvisational gatherings, and crucially, protection from the elements. So I've discovered quickly that there's actually a few meanings that this work is open to portraying. It has quite an ambiguous field that it presents here. And the way I can relate that back to the CAP is, how do I feel about that? What meaning do I make of that? So this work was on display at the Royal Ontario Museum. Could it be that the curatorial decision to have it on display in a Western location away from its inspirations contributes to our fascination with the role of these cultural elements that are at play together? This work speaks to several histories of Indians who felt dominated by Western colonials, as the mobile acts as a powerful symbol of several juxtaposed cultural elements. I must remember as I go through the CAP that it is possible that I have my own personal biases that are interfering with my learning of the cultural context of this work. We need to understand that everyone has their own cultural baggage, and each individual's experiences are valid and may be reflected in how we react to movements or artwork, which we will learn more as we go on to the next step. Personally, as someone who is Indian and grew up in Canada, as the person I am making this presentation, it intrigues me to see these elements from both cultures juxtaposed in one work. I understand that my own background that I've just stated may have a role in my fascination with this work and some questions that I even have. So I want to be very aware of that. So what I mentioned there is part of this process as well. These questions that I'm having and my own process of being intrigued by this work and learning about it, it brings me back to other steps such as my analysis and interpretation, what I made of the work based on my initial reaction. So these will look different for everyone. And when I recall my first impression of the work, I was entirely unaware of the cultural influences of the work from the artist Swapna Tamhain. So everyone will have these varying initial reactions, and that is okay. For me, as I go through each step, I am more understanding of the artist's why they've made this, and what the meanings are to them, and how it relates to me. Our kind of our last step here, but as always, we'll find that we're not entirely done with the CAP, but this would be the expression of aesthetic judgment. So this is where we compare our perception of the artwork after reflection and analysis to our initial reactions. Can we make connections to other artwork? Consider the effectiveness of aspects of the artwork. And here are some sample guiding questions. How effectively does the artist select and combine elements to achieve an intended effect in this work? What works, what doesn't, and why? Has my point of view changed from my initial reaction? How has it changed and why? So we're really picking at some, all these questions that we might have had that have been popping up and coming up with possible answers for these in a way. So I've already kind of touched on this earlier on, but this is my take on the expression aesthetic judgment step. So how do I feel about this artwork and its effectiveness? What would I change with that intention, with what intention in mind? I would say that this artwork is effective in getting the viewer to consider intercultural references in Mobile Palace. My initial reaction involved ideas of the movement in the draped fabric to remind me of ceremonies or celebrations or even weddings. And I'm wondering, could it be that the curatorial decision to have it in display in a Western location away contribute to our fascination of these cultural elements that are at play together? But I want to take these questions and evaluate them in through this work. I do think that her work here is effectively involving several elements and gets the viewer to question what the significance of the patterns and the drapery and the grandeur feeling that comes through this work is. She is successful at creating these questions based on her aesthetic choices. So after reading about Tamhain's visual choices in creating this, it was her intention to refer to a ceremonial aesthetic, which I believe does align. My views from my initial reaction did somewhat align with her her view in making this work and what she was referring to. And if Tamhain wanted to narrow down on the purpose of the tent, for example, that we were looking at, and its non-colonial meaning, it could be surrounded by other elements, perhaps, that validate that it is a wedding tent or a shelter tent or a tent for a specific ceremony. So she could go further into one of these specific scenarios here. But I do appreciate that the ambiguity of the tent. That is where my personal appreciation lies in the aesthetics that she chose to use here. I'm not sure if I would like it as much if it were specifically alluding to one of these uses of a tent or one of these uses of drapery over the other. I like that it is open-ended. So yeah, I do think it is effectively produced. I overall think that this is a great work done by Swepna Tamhain. And that sort of concludes the CAP. However, I did mention that ongoing reflection is a step in the critical analysis process. For now, we have gone through all of these steps, and I have demonstrated ongoing reflection in between these steps as well. And we should also understand that our work is not done here. Through this process we went through, we've involved skills that we can bring to our future understandings of phenomena, movements, and other artwork. And we should continue to evaluate art around us to be able to become better communicators, listeners,